Hi, everybody, and welcome to session 6 of Virtual Learning Series Foundations in Psychedelic Assisted Therapy for Social Workers. My name is Heidi Allen, and I'm the Associate Dean for Research and Associate Professor at Columbia University School of Social Work. Tonight's topic is Healing Race-Related Trauma with Psychedelics with Victor Cabral. This learning series is brought to you by the Psychedelic Therapy Training Program at the Columbia University School of Social Work in partnership with Penn School of Nursing and with generous funding from the Stephen and Alexandra Cohen Foundation and the Joe and Sandy Sandberg Foundation.
And I'm Brooke Stott. I'm the program manager for the Psychedelic Therapy Training Program here at the Columbia School of Social Work. Per usual, just a few administrative notes. As a reminder, this learning series is not intended to be a comprehensive training in providing psychedelic-assisted therapy, but to initiate dialogue and start building foundational knowledge in the field of social work. Notably, for the first time, we have a specific pharmacological drug paired with a specific therapy model under review for approval by the FDA. As social workers make up the largest segment of mental health providers in the United States, it's critical that our clients will have access to these emerging innovations in clinical practice. Also to note again, with the exception of ketamine, these therapies are not yet available in the US outside of a research setting. We're bringing you this content with the anticipated FDA rescheduling of MDMA and psilocybin in the coming years. So tonight's format is going to be a little bit different. It's going to be more of a moderated, co-moderated discussion that will be followed by our usual Q&A section. So we will still have attendee Q&A for the last half hour. But we're going to have this co-moderated. And so I'd like to introduce first Natasha Cote is a second-year extended MSW student specializing in advanced generalist practice and programming. She is the lead organizer of the Psychedelic Caucus, and her service prioritizes equity and justice in the field of psychedelics and social work. I'd also like to introduce Naomi Schwenk. She, her is a biracial, first-generation Asian American woman. She's in her second year as a Columbia School of Social Work MSW student on the Advanced Clinical Practice track. As a member of the Columbia Psychedelic Caucus and aspiring clinician, she is passionate about providing culturally competent, trauma-informed care while working in intersectional spaces with communities of color. And with that, I would like to hand it over for our guest to be introduced and for our discussion.
Thank you. Hey, so just to introduce our speaker, Victor Cabral, LSW, is a collaborative and strategic Afro-Latinx leader who is committed to making an impact in his community and beyond. Victor serves as the Director of Policy and Regulatory Affairs for Fluence Training. Before joining Fluence, Victor served as Deputy Director for the Pennsylvania Governor's Office of Advocacy and Reform, where he co-led the implementation of the Trauma-Informed Pennsylvania Plan and helped establish the first racial day of healing in Pennsylvania history and developed free trauma training for Pennsylvanians. He is trained in Level 1 internal family systems through Black Therapist Rock, psychedelic assisted therapy, and psychedelic harm reduction and integration at PHRI. Victor works to center BIPOC voices in the field of psychedelics by highlighting BIPOC voices in policy and advocacy efforts, art and science. He is currently working on a documentary film titled We Are the Medicine, which explores the reemergence of psychedelics from the perspective of Black, Indigenous, and people of color. Victor is listed on Students for Sensible Drug Policy's list of 40 under 40 outstanding BIPOC leaders in drug policy in the United States. For his work in psychedelic policy, and received the 2022 Emerging Social Work Leader Award from the National Association of Social Workers. So with that, I'm gonna welcome Victor Cabral.
Thank you so much, Natasha. It's a pleasure to be here, and I'm excited for the conversation.
Yes, we are too. So we came up with some questions. First, it's not on the list. I just want to welcome you. How did you come into social work? How did you find social work?
Yeah. So it's kind of a long story, right? But I in 2010, well, I went to Millersville University, and in 2010, I found myself kind of at what I would describe maybe as the lowest point in my life. I failed out of university, the university that I was attending at the time for undergrad. I lost my apartment, and at the time I was 300 pounds, and so I was having some health issues. Um, and essentially what I see that happened was that my trauma and everything that I had kind of suppressed for all those years as a first generation immigrant, as someone with an ACEs score of 8, kind of came to head and really started showing up in my life in very extreme ways. And so I had to leave school, and through that process of me kind of uh, going through what I describe as kind of like a healing journey, I found myself working with youth in the city that I grew up in Reading, Pennsylvania, um, and immediately just fell in love with helping others. And so that, I started, quit my job. I went down the path of helping my community. I worked in a charter school, and then as a mental health case manager, and later as a therapist, um, and then decided that social work was for me. Really, I have a really good friend of mine who had kind of told me about, was helping me make the decision between psychology uh, and social work. And once I got into the social work program, I just realized that it's kind of like who I was up until that point in my life. It was just, now I had definitions and fancy terms to describe the ways in which I've been showing up for a long time. So my best friends who are in the film with me are both social workers as well. And they tell me all the time, like, you were a social worker, since we were in high school. So it's just something that I think was naturally for me.
Yeah, no, that's that I like to start from that point of like, what, how did we get here? And that's beautiful. It's just kind of been with you, and that struggle between psychology and social work. I also had that, and social work just made the most sense. I'm going to go into my first question. So spirituality and diversity aren't mutually exclusive, and social work education is often void of the emphasis on the spirit. Indigenous communities have traditionally used plant medicines for spiritual realignment and other practices. What are your thoughts on incorporating spiritual competence in the social work education for just psychedelic assisted therapy, or just in general? And what does doing your own work look like for social workers seeking to practice with psychedelics?
Yeah, I think with regard to spirituality and the ways in which we kind of turn our backs to it, and I don't think it's just in social work. I think it's general in science um and in education. It's not something that we lean into, right? And yeah, and a lot of the practices that come from indigenous communities are oral traditions, et cetera, that don't necessarily lend themselves to this kind of westernized, like, scientific framework that we use to deem what's appropriate to teach or not. And so I think that there is a lot of room for us to learn from practices that have been established through hundreds and hundreds of years by these communities, both with plant medicines and just in general with their relationship to nature, their relationship to restorative practices in their communities, that I think could be really, really beneficial and really aligned with social work values. If we dig into it, I think indigenous cultures, at least the ones that I've learned about, are inherently kind of social work driven, right? So I think, yeah, I think we should do a lot more to incorporate spirituality in our curriculums, aside from, we talk in social work, we talk about spirituality being part of this, biopsychosocial spiritual kind of system, but that spiritual part we go very superficial when it comes to actually engaging with our clients or even with ourselves with regard to spirituality and what that means and how that can support the work that we're doing. And so I am a supporter of that, and I think that there's a lot of wisdom in Indigenous communities that could really help us be better social workers and better human beings generally. In regards to what it looks like to be doing our own work as social workers, I think doing your own work as a human being is first and foremost, and I think that that translates into doing good work as a social worker. I really enjoyed Ram Dass's How Can I Help? And it talks about all of the ways in which we carry our own stuff into the work that we do, and how to find balance and kind of surrendering into service, and how do we hold that oneness with the work that we're doing, while also dealing with the things that we face as human beings on a daily basis. So I think it starts with us being accountable to ourselves as people, as social workers, and as a social work profession. It starts by us being accountable as a profession to ourselves, right? And so what do we look like advocating to major systems to change and to shift, and but we're not asking or doing things to shift the ways in which we're perpetuating some of those things within our own profession, or maybe within our own practice as an individual social worker.
Thank you so much for sharing your thoughts and experiences with us. I really appreciate how you pulled in Ram Dass's work. Definitely a lot of gold, good information there. We would also love to know, excuse me, what has been the most impactful takeaway from your own trauma healing with psychedelic assisted therapy? And how has psychedelic assisted therapy helped you change your life narrative around race-related traumas?
I think the biggest teaching that I've received through my work, liberation work and healing and medicine in that way, and then sitting with different psychedelic medicines, is that, what does it look like for me to be responsible for everything that happens in my life, right? And in terms of kind of a radical accountability for myself and the way in which I allow or don't allow others or systems or whatever it is to impact me. And of course there are ways that I can't control in which in how they impact me, but there are, where do I have choice and where do I have power? And so in that lesson, what it's taught me is to focus on where I have where I have power, where I have control, where I can build capacity for power, which for me is really in community. And then how do I use that to then try to change the things about the system that I think are or that we know are impacting us in a harmful way. And I'll give a quick example of something that I realized. I was at a training. It was a liberation training, and it was about 10 people of color in a room of, I don't know, 50 people. And I had shared some things with the group that were coming up for me at the time. And of course, it impacted other members of the group that weren't part of the BIPOC group. And so the next day, someone came up to me, and there was this moment of them dumping their guilt about what had transpired. And I got very angry, and then I asked myself, why did I allow that to happen, right? And so it's not to take the responsibility or the accountability from the person that needs to do their work around holding their own guilt and their shame around their identity, but also it was like I had the power in that moment to also say, I don't want to hear this, right? And so where's that balance, and trying to find where I have choice, and I can and I can protect myself and take care of myself in the way that feels right to me.
Reminded me of Kenneth Hardy's writings around rechanneled rage and kind of bringing that back and recentering or refocusing it. That's really powerful. I had a question kind of around that. Just psychedelics can bring us closer to the source, to our ancestors, to spirit, whatever you call it. And just the storytelling and oral traditions of Indigenous communities have been, you know, the intention was to destroy it, right? But here we are. And then how do you incorporate that storytelling into your therapeutic interventions? And then, you know, like I'm thinking about the evidence-based modalities. Do you see a pattern of effectiveness for race-based trauma? Or are there some modalities that you feel that you found might be ineffective within that oral storytelling framework?
Yeah. If I'm being quite honest, I haven't done enough direct work with interventions in that way to be able to say like this is ineffective or this is effective. But what I've found in my work, particularly around integration with folks, and even for myself to kind of going back to the question that Naomi asked, is modalities that allow for folks to explore the narratives that they already hold, right, that have been imposed on them, and gives the client the driver's seat to reclaim that narrative and to retell it in a different way, are what I've seen be most impactful and most effective. So internal family systems, narrative therapy, acceptance and commitment therapy, those kind of modalities where for me personally, I'm not interpreting or making sense of someone's experience or their life or their story for them, and really allowing them to explore that for themselves and to redefine it. And to Naomi's question, what really helped me with psychedelics was being able to rewrite my own story, right? And so I had so many narratives that I was carrying about being a first-generation immigrant, you know, experiencing colorism and internalized colonialization from the culture that I come from, and then being Black in America and all of these things. And I had a very specific narrative around who I was and what I had power to do or not do in my everyday life. And once I was able to really lean into exploring that and looking at it and saying, and then exploring this rich history, not only within my own Indigenous roots or history, but across the world as a global majority, all of the beautiful cultures and the beautiful teachings and wisdom that's there. There was a liberation that came with that, right? Because it was like, oh, I have so much power, even in just like telling my story in the way that I decide to tell it. And so when I think about interventions for clients, it's really about what feels good for them and what allows them to really take control of their lives, and also of the stories that are told about them and the stories that they tell about themselves.
Your experience is a beautiful example of just how powerful it can be to reframe our narratives and in reclaiming our powers. What are some misconceptions about, you know, psychedelic assisted therapy that you feel passionate about debunking?
Yeah, I think the things that I'm passionate about debunking are things that I'm learning myself, right? It's like the concept of, for example, for me, a lot of my work and what I'm passionate about is how psychedelics, not necessarily just psychedelic assisted therapy, that's a whole nother conversation, but how psychedelics can really be a tool for liberation, right? So I moved from being this is the tool to a tool, and what else is available to us, and what other wisdom and what other practices are available to us that aren't just these medicines. And so I think really expanding and educating my community and BIPOC communities on like our how our practices and the way that we are and the things that we carry in our culture, our oral traditions, the way that we are together, the way that we're in community, how those things are also medicine, and how we can recognize those as tools for healing and not just and being careful not to just point to psychedelic assisted therapy as the mechanism for that healing alone. And also even further than that is that this idea that the medicalized model of psychedelic assisted therapy is the only model and the only way to keep people safe, or the only ways, and I think that takes away from people's autonomy and people's ability to build hyper local community-based interventions for themselves that aren't necessarily in the literature but are set in stone in their cultural practices and the ways that they interact.
Yeah, absolutely. It's like if we're with the psychedelics, and now like what else? There's so much more. We can expand outside of psychedelics with the tools that psychedelics can give and go back, and that's beautiful. I wanted to ask about I know Dr. Monica Williams and her research team. It's someone that you've been close with and working with, and they found that various psychedelics can improve the symptoms of racial trauma, and psychedelics can help heal through trauma, but racism is still continuous and insidious and in the air. And the responsibility of healing this social illness is we as the victims or the survivors have to sort of find their own healing through it, yet it still exists. And so how do you help the clients establish the coping and support kind of in between sessions as they step back into those environments?
Yeah, I really think that that's partly an assessment. That's something that we really should be looking at in terms of like what kind of environments folks are going back into. And again, but there are different levels and different ways in which we experience racism and the violence that it perpetuates, right? But I think assessing if someone has that capacity, and I think or that has the community around them to be able to hold what comes up again, especially when they're in that raw kind of open state right after a session. The other thing that I'll add is that I think that and this I'll share from more of a personal place, that as we come into this deep knowing of ourselves and this power that we have within ourselves and within our communities, and the power that we have to structure our communities in a way that we can shield ourselves within those communities from some of these the violence that we face. I think our relationships change to the system, right? And the way that we react to it and the way that we engage with it when we need something. And so a lot of my work took me to state government as like the last ditch effort in my idealistic at the time vision that I was gonna change the system. And I very quickly realized like this doesn't even need an operator anymore. It's like and we know it's set up already with the barriers and the red tape and all of these things that even if you want to make a change, sometimes it's really difficult. And so that took me back to where I started, back to community. So what does it look like when we are in that power and we are in that knowing and we understand what levers to pull, and now we're not asking anymore, right? And it's a different relationship. And so I think that kind of power and that kind of knowing allows us to then react differently to the different the different attacks that we face on a daily basis, right? And to put it back on the person with the microaggression, or to put it back on the company that's put it back on them to figure out their system and their organization and what they need to do to make it more equitable or more accessible. And to really define, what does it look like for me to try to change this or to engage in an emergent strategy within this ecosystem, but taking care of myself, right? And not being a martyr or taking on the burden, that legacy burden of I have to be the one that changes it all, right? Yeah.
As Natasha had mentioned before, like the responsibility of healing as survivors of oppression has been placed upon us as individuals and shifted away from the collective models of community healing. And I really appreciate what you've shared about how powerful community healing truly is, and especially within communities of color. As we're talking about mental health equity, the things that come to mind for me specifically are how expensive regular therapy can be for people of color, and let alone thinking about psychedelic assisted therapy. So how can we increase the accessibility of psychedelic pharmacological care within communities of color while remaining mindful of their race-related traumas? And also, how can we navigate like psychedelic work when we're working specifically with immigrants? And I'm thinking about like how we would navigate like cultural trauma, or like dealing with stigma and being mindful to not cause more harm, or like yeah.
Yeah, so the first part of the question is, how can we advocate for communities of color to access pharmacological care? I think we have to be honest, and generally, at least at the macro level, this is a conversation that I've had before, that we need to advocate for systems that might not necessarily be the systems that we're working within that will provide that access. And so like decrim models, or what we hoped Oregon would look like, and there's some issues there. I think we need to look outside of just the areas that we're working in, or that kind of therapeutic space, and support the development of models that allow for folks to access that within their communities, and yeah, at a local level, because yeah, there's just so much when you talk about even cultural issues that are like, what about undocumented immigrants? What about folks that can access Medicaid or like public health benefits here in the United States, et cetera? So I think we really need to think about expanding what we're advocating for in terms of the access within these systems, within insurance, within that's going to provide that access for therapy and whatnot. That's like a macro policy issue that's being worked on around ensuring that insurance is reimbursed, that insurances are yeah, so that's like a macro issue I think that we need to work on further, and we're very early on, and I think it's going to take some time. But where I see this going in the future is having multiple models that are appropriate for different communities and different individuals. So you have folks who are going to want to go to a trained social worker or psychologist, et cetera, to get their care. And then you're going to have folks who aren't going to want to be in that because of previous harm, because they don't want to engage with the systems, or because it's not accessible to them. And yeah, so I use this kind of as, it's not really a joke, but I use this often where I say, like, if I have the best insurance and I'm going to this, psilocybin assisted therapy place that costs $5,000 for a cycle of therapy, and my neighbor doesn't have insurance, but it costs $8 for them to grow mushrooms in their house, we have to be realistic about, like, if we really want people to have access, and we really want people to to be able to heal, we need to talk about models that are going to give people that access in a safe way, that don't necessarily benefit us as agents of the systems that we work for.
Love that. I was kind of going to ask along those lines of, in your practice, kind of cultivating with your client that setting, and what if the setting is outside of those four walls, and how do you kind of cultivate the setting with your participants?
Yeah, so I'm currently working, for example, on our second iteration of our trauma-informed care training in Oregon for psilocybin facilitators. And one of the things that that I want to bring into the ways in which not only we sit with clients, but also the way that we do this work is ceremony, right? And really, and so listening to the client, and what does ceremony look like within their culture? What does ritual look like within their culture? What are the practices within their cultures? And how do you create an environment collaboratively with that client as much as you can in four walls, right? In a sterile kind of medical environment, right? That creates an environment where someone can feel safe and feel connected to their identity, the core of their identity. And so, yeah, looking at those things from in a cultural specific way with the client, allowing them to define that and allow them to explore that and to bring in what feels important to them, I think is a major way to do that.
Considering what you had mentioned earlier about securing safe access for various models of psychedelic intervention, I'd love to hear your thoughts on the emergence of medical psychedelic care via telehealth, and how this could impact communities of color, and like connecting that back to the equity conversation.
Yeah, I have a ton of concerns about that specifically. One around abuse potential, right? I think there was recently an article that came out that said that 55% of folks that were doing telehealth ketamine were using it in a way that was outside of kind of the protocol that they were supposed to be working in. And I know that I've had CAT practitioners who I'm in a relationship with run into some issues, particularly with BIPOC communities, of folks being able to go across state lines and see other doctors and get other prescriptions, et cetera. So I think that there's a lot of issues that could come up with telehealth and ketamine. I think we're going to see some of those issues. I mean, recently, President Biden reinstated some of the regulations that were in place before the pandemic, which now, after you can get one prescription, but after 30 days, I believe you then have to see a psychiatrist in person to be able to get the prescription. So I think we're taking steps, and that there's awareness around how this could go wrong. Particularly for BIPOC communities, I do have concerns around, just like the abuse potential of ketamine, and ensuring like harm reduction and education, and not from a patronizing perspective, but just from the understanding of how this could impact the community.
Okay. Yeah, I had another kind of like more of like that clinical question around what tools help you, if it comes up, what tools help you move through any of the like cultural transference or counter transference exchanges that could come up during like a psychedelic session. Because I can imagine those transference might look or feel different when someone's in a medicine session.
That's something that happens like regularly, even outside of sessions, just in everyday life, of that kind of projection, right, of our experiences, et cetera, or that's something that I'm navigating, honestly, as a human being. And I think in sessions, I think it's important to listen to the client's experience and really spend time with them, getting to know what their experience is in their particular identity, and when it's appropriate, self-disclosing, right? And not moving immediately to the ways in which things are similar, right? But really paying attention to where the differences lie, because you can harm someone by making an assumption or by not being clear about your own privileges, for example, like social locating with a client, right? And addressing power dynamics in a session are ways in which I think you can start to set the tone for when those things come up. You can support a client, you can empathize with them, you can be compassionate without letting your own stuff get in the way, or without taking on a projected role or a projected experience that might not be yours. But I have, as I was mentioning earlier, not only in my work as a clinician, but also generally, I have to stay very aware of that. I grew up in the hood. I grew up in poverty. I'm a first generation immigrant. I've very recently have witnessed, like, being pulled over by police and harassed, etc. I presented on that at Horizons. And I have a master's degree, and I live in the suburbs with my wife and kids, and I don't have to worry about food on my so all of these things, it's like, how do I hold those things that we connect with, but also give respect and honor in the ways to the ways that my experience is no longer the same, so that I can hold that client in the ways that they need to be held in the space.
Do you have any advice for people of color or clinicians in general that are aspiring to become not only psychedelic assisted therapists, but those that want to be trauma informed, but maybe don't know where to start?
Yeah, I make noise. So for me, and I'll share my experience a little bit. In 2016, I had my first psilocybin experience, and I live in Reading, Pennsylvania. It's like, if you've ever played Monopoly, the Reading Railroad on the Monopoly board, that's where I'm from. There was no conversations happening around psychedelics here, but I knew that I had come across something that was impactful and significant. And so the way in which I was able to make my way in the space was, one, I started telling my story. I started getting in touch with my story, and then I started going out there, even in the spaces where I wasn't maybe not welcomed, or it seemed like I wasn't welcome because there was not people that looked like me. And I started bringing people with me that did have my experiences or were from my community. And that's how I've been able to make a career in the psychedelic spaces. One, I knew what I wanted, and then I intentionally put myself in spaces where I was able to interact with organizations or individuals who were able to offer me opportunities or educate me. And as I did that, I also brought other people with me. So one of my mantras that one of my friends tells me all the time is, wherever you go, bring somebody that looks like you. If they're not in that space, right? Bring somebody with your experience, diversify the space. So I would say, put yourself out there, be confident in your experience and in your story and what you have to offer. And there's a lot of different ways to contribute to this space, especially for social workers. Like, when I transitioned, I graduated with my master's in 2019. And at the time, I thought it was like, I either have to be a psychedelic therapist and, I have to get trained, and that's the only thing I could do. But then I was like, oh, there's this whole other policy kind of perspective that I could use to inform my work as a clinician and also to inform the work I do on a macro level. So it's really like getting in touch with what you're passionate about, where it is that you want to go in the space, and then really putting yourself out there and networking and talking to people to try to make those connections.
Yes, putting ourselves out there. It's definitely very hard, but it's such a part of this work in that building of community. And I had one more question, but you already kind of answered it earlier. It was around something Rick Doblin said some time ago about net zero trauma and moving from fundamentalism to mysticism through a cultural context where enough people have had psychedelic experiences. It kind of brought up the, moving towards net zero trauma by 2070. It's very, it's a big vision. And I'm hearing quite often kind of people speak about psychedelics as sort of being a cure-all. And this also came up when SSRIs, were discovered and commercialized. So what are your thoughts on the impacts of naming psychedelics or a therapist, a healer, anything as the cure-all for trauma? And what do you think we can try to do to sort of ground that?
Yeah, yeah, I think I did touch earlier on that can be we can pigeonhole ourselves right into this idea that and miss out on all of the other ways in which we have to engage with other ways of healing and medicine to actually be able to I think to bring the most healing to ourselves and to the communities we serve. I think for context with Rick's comment, based on my personal conversations with him and my relationship with MAPS generally on the policy side, is that MAPS is doing some work around sentencing guidelines and the drug war, and really leaning into these other systemic issues, and generally just the way that they're bringing MDMA through the FDA system with like a therapy attached, like all of that, I think is I think I guess what I'm saying is that I don't think that Rick's dream that he describes when he says that also includes all of this other kind of like underlying work that MAPS is doing around like systemic issues that aren't discussed as often, I guess. And in terms of what we can do to really ensure that doesn't happen, that we don't start to name these medicines, is that we have to build a voice as a community, as leaders in the space, and really talk about, and I think for BIPOC folks specifically, when you bring your unique experience and the unique ways in which your community or your culture engages in healing or engages in community, engages in medicine, like body work, like all of these other ways in which we can really address our trauma, then it expands the conversation and beyond just this medicine. And I've been confronted myself before by not in any in any like aggressive way or anything like that, but I have had folks tell me like, yes, psychedelic assisted therapy is great, but like our communities need so much more than that, and there's so much more to do there. And so I think when we get in community and we're having these conversations, generative conversations, then we can start to actually build frameworks or build new ways of talking about the medicines and expanding what that means, like what medicine means, right?
I really love how you tie in how we can bring in a shift in the framework, and how we as a society approach our perspective to not only psychedelics, but like therapy along with it. I'm curious how you navigate honoring traditional indigenous roots of psychedelics within your own work in your space with your clients.
So I'll start within my own work. Within my own work, there's been a process of like unlearning and being accountable to myself and to my community and my work for the ways in which I perpetuate the very same things that I am impacted by and I'm trying to fight against. And so that's for me, that's looked like a reconnection with my own history as a Dominican. You know, my parents are from Dominican Republic. Building an altar, which is something that is part of my culture that I never understood or even honored or valued until I started to really change that narrative and really explore what it meant for us and why I thought that it wasn't something that was honorable or helpful. In terms of clients, I think it's the same in like helping clients see that the ways in which they supporting clients and really bringing forth the ways in which they're already in connection to their roots. And if they're not, because they're so far removed for one reason or another, supporting the client and really starting to explore what is that, if that's something that they're interested in. And I think through that process, an unlearning happens, and then folks are able to build new practices or reimagine practices or even rediscover them. And that's been the case for me. Like I'm still learning, like my mom, when I was growing up, we'd have like a, I don't know what you call that in English, like a bureau. I don't know if that's what you call it, but it's called bureau in Spanish. But basically the thing with the mirror in the room that has all the
vanity.
Yeah. So she used to put like pictures on that and like all these other things, and I'm like, and now I realize like it was an altar, right? Like it was like an altar, right? And there's all these like really beautiful things that I couldn't see before about my culture, about myself, or about the way that I am, that I navigate the world, that I slowly am able to rediscover as I'm doing that healing work. And I think it's helping clients also see that, especially BIPOC communities, like a lot of our practices, a lot of the ways in which we show up in the world, we're made to think that those practices are useless. We're made to think, that they're the devil, right? When it comes to my culture and religion and all of that. Even twerking, right? Like I've even like thought about twerking and how trauma lives in the body, and like what role does us moving our bodies in that way play in us moving trauma through our bodies, through dancing and through like art and all of that. So like there's a beauty in these things that we've been taught by this like colonialized, patriarchal, white supremacist culture that don't have value when they actually do. And so how do we help ourselves and help our clients find that value in who they are and where they come from?
Oh, that is so real. Just coming back. My family is from Ghana. So I'm first generation, and it's the journey of getting older and coming back, and something I rejected in like a very white suburban community that I grew up in. And as I've gotten older, it's reclaiming my heritage and language and noticing those pieces. So that really resonated with me. And as you were talking, I was thinking about family and coming back home. What tools, internal family systems, what tools do you use in that, bringing the family, kind of the client into family? Of course, sometimes it's not safe or it's not the time, but how does family play a role in the work you do?
Yeah, it's funny. Right before I hopped on this on for this, a friend of mine who's an IFS level 3 therapist, she sent me a video of this clinician that was talking about um the systems of oppression and the systems and the way that they impact us, and how the family is also a system, right? And the family dictates what's acceptable, what's not, what's okay, and what's, is bullying okay, is teasing okay, is, all of these different behaviors. Um, and so um, IFS is really about the internal family and coming back to that core self and that self energy, and engaging with these parts that we've thrown away and exiled, or the parts that have developed to help us survive. But when we look at the family as a system, it's helping the client build the capacity to set boundaries, or like really understanding what the family system looks like, and the different roles folks play, and then helping the client and empowering the client through that process to really change their relationship with that system, and to also redefine themselves out, outside of that system and in relationship with that system. So a lot of times, like, psychedelics is about like stepping outside ourselves, stepping outside the systems, stepping outside the narratives and the stereotypes and all of these other things that are imposed on us, and then restructuring the narrative, restructuring our relationships, and then deciding whether or not those systems are safe for us to go back into, and if they are safe, in what ways can we return to that system in a way that's taking care of us as an individual human being. So with a client, it's really about recognizing the different roles in the family, how that impacts them, how that's helpful to their healing or not. And then they have to make a choice about how they then go back and engage with those systems. And again, that's part of assessment, because if that's the only support that a person has, and it may turn out that they can no longer rely on that support through that work, then we have to think about other ways to make sure that the client is supported in the long term.
Absolutely. And for those that are unsure about how to approach seeking becoming like a psychedelic assisted therapist, whether through training or licensure, what programs do you personally recommend, and what would you consider your biggest learning curves within this space as a person of color?
So in terms of programs, you mean like educational opportunities for? So I mean, I work for Fluence Training, so we offer a bunch of trainings, from like just very basic integration. We offer clinical consultation. We have certificate programs, and there's a ton of different courses out there, and places offering different types of education. So I think it's really looking for the place that feels right for you, and what you're looking for. I don't think that there's one of the things that I felt coming into this space, the learning curve I was in a rush, right? So before I was actually in this space and I was still working at the governor's office, I was like, I gotta get trained in MDMA, I gotta get trained in all these things, and I gotta be ready, because if not, the train's gonna leave me. And then I got into the space and I realized, like, oh, we're figuring this out, as like we're building the plane as we're flying it, right? And so I would say, like, slowing down, being really intentional about the direction you want to go in, and what you want to learn, and what you want to lean into. And the second biggest curve is that the psychedelic space is just like any other system that we already engage in. It's not, so me going in, again, I was very idealistic of like, it's psychedelic space, everyone's going to be different, everyone's going to be doing their work, everyone's going to be, but the systemic issues that we face widely are as we know, they're just perpetuated, right, and within the psychedelic space too. So that's real, and that's that was part of my learning, of understanding, like, that there was work to do within this space as well, and to the to your questions around, like, making sure that we don't say like psychedelics are going to save the world, or that's part of that, right? It's like this field is not gonna necessarily change the world. There's still work that we need to do. And it's okay to, for me, it's okay to be excited about what's happening and the shift, but we can't lose sight of the things that we still need to be trying to shift and change at the systemic level.
Thank you so much. Those are Naomi and I's questions. And we're going to move into the Q&A. The first question someone had is, so yeah, how do you define spirituality, just in general?
That's a big question. I think for me, one way is how connected am I to the idea of oneness, right? How connected am I to the idea that we, on a certain level, are all the same, made of the same stuff, and you know, and that's come through my experiences, right? My transcendent experiences. So that's one level of it. But then in this duality that I live in, and in the identity that I have, right, and the realities that I face on a daily basis, spirituality for me is like, how am I loving and being in community with other human beings, the community that I serve, with myself at my core, with my true self. And I was going to say something else, and I wasn't prepared to answer this question. It's a good one. I'll have to think more about it. But yeah, I think it's just a way of like, how much am I being? Like being love, being compassion, being, how much am I in touch with my shadow? How, and, you know, it's so many things. It's like, what's my connection to my ancestry and my ancestors and the history, and my connection to the descendants, those that'll come after us. What am I doing? So it's just like, I don't have words for it. It's kind of like this essence of just trying to be as authentic as I can be, with my relationship to self and like, and everything else.
And I just wanted to speak to that real quick before Naomi asks the next one. Just the shadow and how connected we are to the shadow. I think that there's that spiritual bypassing sometimes. And so as you said that, it's all of it. And it just made me think about some of the fears people might have around psychedelic experience, and that shadow maybe coming out, and how it's a part of the challenging aspects of it, is a part of the experience. So yeah, thank you for sharing that. It's like a hard question because it's just everything.
Yeah, literally, right? Yeah, and yeah, it's everything, right? And I also say that like the shadow is really, for me, that's where the actual work is at, right? Like that's whether it's the shadow of the organization that we're operating in, or the shadow of the systems that we're working with, or the profession, right? What's in the shadow of the social work profession? Are we dealing with that? Are we addressing that? Are we aware of that? Are we telling truth? Is speaking truth to what those things look like? So yeah.
I really love how you just highlighted the various shadows that can loom over us individually. Because like when you said shadow, what came to mind is, for me, it was like a lot of traumas, like whether it's race related or childhood related, and how they tend to like impact us even in our adulthood. And so thanks for highlighting all of the various ways to interpret that word within this space. One of our participants has asked, you underwent your own psychedelic assisted therapy, and if so, how many sessions, and what was your experience like? Like, was it visions, visitations from ancestors or spirits, and where was it conducted?
Yeah, so I've had a lot of different experiences since 2016 in Europe, and most recently in Ecuador. Also in my ketamine training, it was an experiential training. So it's been different. It depends on the space that I was in. The only official like that I would qualify as like psychedelic assisted therapy in regards to like a medical practice would be when I went through my experiential ketamine training. And that was over the course of 2 days in Colorado. And that, the what I got out of that particular experience was just like, don't take yourself so seriously. Don't take the work so seriously that you kind of lose yourself in that. The other experiences that I've had have been led. So when I was in Ecuador, the doctor that was leading the retreat was also a trained shaman, like trained in a lineage. And that was over the course of 9 days. Yeah, I think I've had so many different experiences that it's hard to pinpoint, but generally what I've come to learn from all of these different experiences is like really being honest with myself and what my shadow is, right? And that includes like the things I've been through, but it also includes all of the ways in which I'm everyone will be the victim and the perpetrator at some point, right? And so like for me, and that's my understanding, right? I've been the victim and I've also been the perpetrator of harms, and I will be going through that cycle for the rest of my life. And so how do I hold myself accountable in that? And how do I build compassion for myself in that so I can grow? And how do I extend that compassion to others? And so what's come up for me has been like childhood trauma. It's been ancestral, like I carry most recently a lot of ancestral stuff, a lot of family trauma, a lot of global stuff, kind of like karmic like stuff. It really depends on where I'm at in my life and like where I'm at in my growth, and now I'm moving back into kind of like some childhood attachment stuff.
Victim, offender, it's a cycle. It's that light and dark that we'll keep facing. It's real. And I wanted to get to a question someone had about IFS and psychedelic assisted therapy specifically. I know you touched on that earlier, but I think maybe they wanted to think about the intersection between them.
Yeah, so generally in my training up until this point, a lot of what we've been taught is to be non-directive, and so I personally have not used like IFS with folks. And some of the clinicians that I know that are working on clinical trials or are working with ketamine, et cetera. I know some folks that have worked with ketamine and IFS, but generally with the other medicines, you have to kind of follow the protocol that's on the clinical trial. So it doesn't really allow for you to bring these other modalities, because then it won't be, you won't meet the protocol or whatever when they're assessing. For me, IFS, I went through IFS training, and it provided this other level of understanding of myself and getting in touch with all of these different parts, that we are multitudes, right? And we have no parts are bad parts, and any part that's showing up in a way that's unhealthy is usually because it has a need. And so a lot of the work in IFS is engaging with those different parts, and being able to find out what the need is there, where so it might be your childhood part, it might be a critical part, it might be a suicidal part, it might like all of these different parts that come up that get tracked by the practitioner. So when you think about psychedelics, right, like the experience can be that, where we're going into these different memories, right? A memory can be a part. We're going into these different parts of ourselves, some that we don't want to look at because we've exiled that part, or because it's been something that we suppressed or is in our subconscious mind. And so for me, IFS is a really good tool to prep clients to be able to navigate in that way with their parts. So when they're in the experience with psychedelics, they're really able to like understand how to engage with maybe a part that's really dark and is really hard to look at, or a memory that's really difficult to engage with. And through my conversations, that's been my experience, and that's how it fits, that it's really, you have that core self. And for me, that's like that spirit, that like pure kind of you that you experience when you're in a mystical state or in an altered state with psychedelics. And then you have all of these different parts that show up, right? And so IFS really aligns with that kind of view, that transpersonal kind of perspective.
There's some questions about change and what that looks like. And earlier you mentioned emergent strategy. And I really love Adrienne Marie Brown, and she talks about intentional adaptation. I don't know if maybe you'd want to speak to that, just to kind of bring those questions that came up together.
Yeah, so yeah, I love Adrienne Marie Brown. I feel like when I found her book, like people had been recommending her to me. I just followed her on Instagram and share like all her memes and stuff. But then when I started reading Emergent Strategy, I felt like, oh my God, I found like my Bible for the work that I do. And so Emergent Strategy is really like, how do you ebb and flow with the work that you're doing, and moving away from this like going up against, and how do we operate from like this generative kind of visionary, imaginative place. And so with intentional adaptation, earlier I was talking about that once we're in that knowing, and once we're in that power, then we can choose and be intentional about the ways in which we adapt to the system or how we move around it. And it's a choice rather than a forced kind of survival response, which in my case, a lot of the times the ways in which I adapted was really just me trying to survive around, in an organization or within the community that I lived in, where as I came into this healing and this power, there was an intentional choice to say like, okay, I'm going to stay in this situation, or I'm going to engage with this system in this way to get this thing that I need to happen for my community or for myself. So emergent strategy for me is really this being like water. She talks a lot about being like water, right? So if you pour water into a cup, it becomes a cup. If you pour it into a bowl, it becomes a bowl. And so how can we move in that way, but with intention, and not just being pushed around by the systems that we operate within? And yeah.
In addition to emergent strategies, are there any texts or readings that have been particularly helpful for engaging in psychedelics with others? So many classics are colonial and extractive, like Wasson. Sorry if I'm mispronouncing that.
Yeah, so I think anything by Adrienne Marie Brown, I would highly recommend. Pleasure Activism, Emergent Strategy, The Four Agreements. I really like How Can I Help by Ram Dass. Unlearn by Humble the Poet. I also really enjoy Young Pueblo's work. He's a poet, but I think it could be useful because a lot of the lessons that he shares feel very like they're psychedelic insights. I don't know how much I know he's into like extended periods of meditation and things like that, but those are some tools that I think are beneficial. You Are Your Best Thing. This book was published by Brene Brown, but it's all of the authors in the book that contributed are BIPOC folks, and sharing their stories, including Duran Young, who's a good friend of mine, and the founder of Black Therapist Rock. The Deepest Well by Nadine Burke Harris. Yeah, and those are some of the ones. I mean, I have like 300 titles in my reading list. So,
Thanks for sharing those. The next question is, hello, thank you for your work. Over time, the awareness of pain and barriers faced by an entire community can weigh heavily on the people who are trying to help the community find healing. Sort of a bioaccumulation of trauma in talking about therapists, practitioners who work with marginalized groups experiencing trauma. Do you have any recommendations for personal and/or collective practices to help therapists maintain awareness of the trauma and its impact while also moving and releasing it so it does not compromise the well-being of the therapist over time? How can we work together as a community to integrate the personal trauma of witnessing one's own community's pain and transmute it to use it for good?
oh, thank you. Yeah, that's real. And if I'm being honest with you, like I'm learning myself how to hold it, and how to release it. And so, one of the things that I'm learning with my therapist and in my own work is carving out intentional time to grieve, and to allow ourselves to let that move through, right? And actually, this just came up in my conversation with her not too long ago, but I laughed because I've been watching this show called Shrinking on Apple Plus, and it's about a therapist, and his supervisor has this will turn on his phone on like a 15-minute timer and just like sob for 15 minutes straight and grieve, and then like turn it off and go back to his normal life. And I was like, maybe I need to start doing that. But on a serious note, I think what I'm learning is that we need to be able to carve out intentional time to sit with the things that we're witnessing and process them. And I think we're go, especially me. My experience has been my trauma doesn't matter. Not only the trauma that I carry, but also the trauma that I'm experiencing right now. It's like I don't have time to address this because I need to do this work. But in the long term, that's not healthy. We're not going to be around to provide the support, and also we're not operating from a place that's healthy. So I think having our own community spaces, having other healers and folks that are doing the work who come together intentionally to help move some of that energy together, to talk about the challenges that you're facing, to talk about sometimes just the burnout that you're experiencing or the frustration, whether it's on the macro level, because you do get systems burnout just as much as you get like burnout when you're working one-on-one with clients. For me, that looks like sometimes getting my community of social workers together and we go dancing, or sometimes we'll go to the beach, or sometimes we'll rent a cabin in the middle of nowhere and spend a couple of days together hanging out. Sometimes that means a vacation together. Sometimes that means we just get together just to talk about whatever it is that we're experiencing and going through, and allowing that to move, and moving that energy together. Sometimes it could be easier to sit with those feelings and move that energy when we do it collectively rather than trying to do it on our own, especially if we're burned out or just struggling. So I hope that was helpful, but I say all that to say that I'm learning to how to move through that.
Yeah, I just want to make one comment on the burnout and on what holding it looks like, and even identifying that it is an issue. It can be hard to even identify what is burnout, what is the work with the maybe agency I'm working in, how is it not aligning with my values, like what is that? And so I really appreciate you bringing that in and for that question to the person who asked it.
And I just want to add that that's part of the legacy burden that we carry as like BIPOC folks doing this work, is that added responsibility of like, you know, working in our communities is just different in like the things you see and experience like back to back to back to back every day are pretty intense. And so I think part of the way that we've been socialized, or you know, as social workers and as people of color, is like you have to carry all of this, and like it's your job to and just do it, and for not a lot of pay and for not a lot of appreciation. And so like unlearning all of that as well is part of like being in the community space and allowing ourselves to like to let go of some of that.
Absolutely. I really love your use of the word of legacy burden, and bringing in how, like, as people of color and as social workers, that, you know, can be extra daunting for us to navigate through the space with. Before we wrap up today, is there anything else that you would like to add here next?
No, I'm just really grateful for all the questions and for the invitation, and yeah, I'll plug in like my Instagram, and I don't have a website, but I have a LinkedIn and an Instagram. And then if you want to check out the film that I'm working on, which is titled We Are the Medicine, you can visit the website pictureacolorfulworld.com, and you can subscribe there to the mailing list. We're actually about to release a new trailer, which includes like a bunch of really amazing footage from Iceland and some other places that we've been since we started filming. So yeah, just gratitude to everyone who came, and for all the questions and for the opportunity to share.
Thank you so much. Look forward to seeing you hopefully at the Psychedelic Science Conference.
Yeah, I'll be there all week, and yeah, we have some exciting things that we'll be announcing soon, like BIPOC centered stuff that we'll be doing there too. So
Yay. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you all
That
so
was-
much for this conversation. It's truly been wonderful. And Naomi and Natasha, you've been fantastic moderators. And Victor, I feel like I just learned so much. Thank you for bringing everything that you bring and to this work. I think particularly as a social worker, there's not that many social workers. I'm very grateful to have you here. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Bye.